Hello, this is Braden Matson, co-founder of growthquotient.com. This is the Brand Burger podcast. If you like this show or episode, please do rate it and or share it. That helps me out a ton. Also, if you want to be a guest, just drop me a line on LinkedIn and we will set it up. Thank you very much for listening. And without further ado, super stoked to get into today's episode. Let's go. All right. I am really excited for this one. It's the first episode we're doing actually with two guests, so three people. My goal is to speak as little as possible. I'll let them intro themselves in one quick sec, but with me today, I have Christian Hollums and Auke Hunneman, two just absolute heavy hitters in their spaces. I'm going to let them intro themselves, and we're going to get pretty nerdy today, but I think it's going to be a really, really fun one. It's not a lot of conversations that I think happen, so my hope is that we can have a conversation that is very unique. So without further ado, though, I'd love for the both of you to introduce yourselves. Christian, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Christian Hollums. Basically, I've been in some form of marketing or sales for since I was 19. I'm 43 now.
Okay, 20 years.
Yeah, I started in car sales actually, 19 years old, and started there, moved my way up into management, both new cars, used cars, and even did some finance and insurance or the financial side of things. But I've run a couple of different companies, some successful, some not so successful, and gosh, I've worked at both, like I would say, I ran an agency for about 7 years up in Alaska, and that was, to be completely honest with you, probably one of the best times in my life. Our primary vertical, if you will, was tourism. So I got to fly around in helicopters and planes because tourism is it's a big business there. Obviously, COVID was horrible for tourism. So I had to kind of pivot and I ended up moving back to Texas, and I'm here now consulting for brands or businesses that do about anywhere from, like, I would say 1 million to 50 million in revenue a year. So kind of smaller scale. I'm not working with any like Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 companies, don't have any experience there. I have more experience with smaller businesses, mainly in marketing, and I've helped in sales a little bit. But yeah, down here in Texas, it's relatively cool today in Houston, so which is welcome for sure. But that's a quick highlight on me for sure.
A lot of meat there. Thank you. And Auke, go for it.
Yes, Auke Hunneman. I'm actually an academic. I'm an associate professor in marketing at BI Norwegian Business School. I'm based in Norway, but I'm originally from the Netherlands. I did my PhD in economics and have been specialized in marketing. And I work a lot with analytics, so modeling. And that's also the reason that I'm appointed associate dean for a program in business analytics at the same school. I've also consulted for some firms here in Norway, like small companies, typically also problems related to marketing and data. And on the side, I've been reading philosophy, and that's the reason that I'm on this podcast, probably, because that's a kind of hobby of me. And I actually like thinking about how our current worldview is actually affecting the way we do business and the way we engage with the world around us, in fact. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation because I've given some thought on what the marketing implications are, but I'm also curious to hear about what Christian has to say on this topic.
Exactly. It's why I'm so excited too. And so if we can just jump in there with what just fundamentally philosophy, main pillars, and then what does that have to do with marketing at all?
Maybe you start, Christian.
You're the PhD, man.
I agree, but not in philosophy.
Well, I'm definitely not a PhD in philosophy. I mean, let's just be clear about that. I've worked with small businesses. I mean, for me, a lot of this is it's funny because I didn't really get into academic things. I hated college. Did not want to go to college, didn't do college. I mean, I got a board certification in holistic nutrition. That's the only schooling I've really had in terms of formal schooling. So just to be clear about that. So most of my work with philosophy has been primarily concerned with metaphysics. And I mean, there's a lot of philosophy is a really big topic, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different types of philosophy, analytic philosophy, continental philosophy. But what I'm most probably drawn to is metaphysics. And those are things, essentially metaphysics is beyond the physical world, right? And so the thing that I've kind of noticed is philosophy is essentially just what we believe about whatever given subject that we're talking about. I mean, I think that's the most simple way to look at it, right? Without us getting into the history of philosophy or the different types of philosophies that are out there. And so for me with marketing, it's like I kind of read philosophy as my own like little weird ass hobby of reading about things that probably drive other people mad. Like they don't want to read them. Or like, why would I read this? I don't understand. I got to get a dictionary out to look at these words and see what they are. And I guess I like that. But what I just kind of continue to, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but underneath everything that we do in marketing and everything that we think about, we have underlying assumptions or beliefs and a worldview that shape how we are going to approach marketing, how we understand customers, and just even from our own ethics about what's ethical, what makes sense. I'd say that's kind of how I look at philosophy 101. And the simplest way to not like bore people is just like, what are your belief systems? What are your underlying assumptions that you bring to whatever topic that you're doing or whatever practice that you're doing? I would say that's philosophy.
I agree with you. And I think this worldview is a very important aspect here because like we have very scientific worldview. And I mean, that's like the fish in the proverbial water, right? We don't realize that. But I think we actually have this very efficiency-oriented way of looking at things. And I think that's actually becoming increasingly problematic because that assumes that you can break things down in parts and everything is caused by mechanics. Like we have the machine kind of metaphor that we use, and people don't question those things, but they have huge implications for the way you look at the world. And I mean, that is for economics the case. It's for like, anything that you relate to in the world is actually the case. But it's something that you take for granted. And I actually think that you see around us that this worldview actually is reaching its limits. People are looking for meaning, and people don't find meaning in the scientific worldview any longer. And I actually think that's becoming problematic, and I mean that's beyond marketing in a way, but it is also again related to marketing. So I think that's something that I would like to talk about, and like it's very interesting that in fact, like if you look at ancient wisdom, I mean you can actually see that people have struggled with those questions before, and we have kind of abandoned that, which is part of the problem. So if you think about it very simply, then like you could say, like, we have actually currently adopted science as the only portal to find truth. There are other portals, like philosophy is one of them, the arts is another one, religion is a third one, and we don't look at those things anymore as like portals to truth. In fact, we think that there's only one truth out there, and that we ultimately should all agree on what that truth is. And I think that's probably something that you cannot even realize. That's a wrongly formulated problem from the outset, in a way. And I think that's kind of the problem that we are talking about. Like scientism, I have nothing against science because I'm working in academia. Like that science is our only portal to truth, I think is problematic.
I mean, just the language of truth. That's a metaphysical concept. It's not something that we can measure. No. Does that make sense? It's not something that you can figure. Like people will say, well, this is just reality. We're painting a picture of reality. And reality as such is a metaphysical, it's beyond the physical world. It's not something, I think what I was hoping to touch on, everything that you're talking about, is this kind of that first person versus the third person perspectives. Understanding that how these two are not like really, because I feel like a lot of times I've had these conversations with other people in marketing that are well credentialed and very knowledgeable, and I've even been called a purist. I don't even know what it means, but I have no idea what that person meant when they said that. And I'm not going to name names, but it's just, it seems as if the way that everyone, when I have these conversations, it seems that the third person perspective, which is the scientific method, right? The observer observing physical phenomena is mistaken or is believed to be the only picture of reality, as if it's the ultimate picture of reality, or even this concept of it's purely objective. But yeah, I was hoping maybe we could dive like even kind of, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Auke, and then even obviously yours, Braden, on just kind of like maybe even starting on like the first person versus the third person. And we could tie like how that relates to marketing, actual customers, people, right? And their first person perspectives, and how we are utilizing data from a third person perspective, because that's essentially what all data is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's well put actually, and I think that is like it's a little bit related to the problem that we don't trust intuitions anymore, right? Like we have the idea that like things need to be measured and justified in order to make the right decisions, even though I mean a first person perspective would probably take intuition and common sense as a starting point, right? And I think that's also something that influences the way we make decisions. And like a good analogy is like, I mean, people don't drink H2O, right? I mean, they drink water. Like that's basically the difference what we are talking about. Like the third person perspective versus first person perspective. And like there's also something related to this, I think, which is like whether you focus on outcomes or a process. I think, and this is actually some stuff that I borrowed from Whitehead, the philosopher, but I think we have tendency because of our measurement to always focus on the outcomes, right? But in principle, I mean, it's the experiences that matter, right? And like that cannot even be captured. So as soon as you start measuring things, you have like a zillion externalities, right, that you don't take into account. So like the first person perspective, and I think that also holds for intuitions, is by definition richer than anything that we can measure. And we have actually the opposite belief. We say like, okay, but intuitions are biased and like, it's limited information that you take into account. But I think it's the opposite. Like as soon as you start putting something in language, whether that's mathematical or it's the ordinary language that we use on a daily basis, then you start losing information. Like I don't really understand why we actually have moved away from the intuitive decision making, apart from the fact that it's easier to justify something. And that's of course what you see in online platforms, right? I mean, like just that you have data on something doesn't mean it's like a better tool. I think we typically, like if you bring it a little bit to the context of marketing, I think we have now the assumption that as soon as you can measure things, that you have control over it, and that therefore it's better. That's of course not necessarily the case.
As you were talking there, I thought of a late theologian named Bonson, who kind of coined this term crackers in the pantry fallacy, which is this idea that everything is just proven in the same way, right? In other words, like if I'm trying to prove that there's crackers in the pantry, well, I just look, right? And then that leads into what is ultimately at the bottom of, I mean, you could call it scientism or an empiricist worldview, however you want to layer that, but ultimately, like just this assumption that, well, all knowledge just comes from observing things, which of course that proposition itself can't be observed, but maybe that's another discussion. I'd love to bring this now down into like in terms of, so Christian, you were mentioning just the difference really between how this plays out in reality in terms of inside of a market with actual human beings, because there's a difference there between people and human beings and intuition and subjective experience and then data. So I'd love to just drill in a little more there in terms of how does the way we see the world in this regard lead marketers to do the wrong things and measure things incorrectly, do you think?
Yeah, I think I just would piggyback off some of the stuff that Auke has already said. It's that, I mean, the predictability and the control is really kind of the driver for all of this, I think. And at the end of the day, like if we want to get relational, and everything that we're doing is highly relational, we're trying to like understand the market, and you get into a relationship. Right. This may not seem like it's about marketing, but it is. I mean, you get into a relationship and you understand that there's going to be risks associated with being in a relationship with someone. There's vulnerability. And there are just things that like, maybe you want to mitigate some of that risk and you don't want to be reckless. But at the end of the day, like vulnerability is just a reality of our existence. So I think the driver, while understandable, because, businesses want to feel safe and they want to feel like they're creating security for both them, for their own, for their own interests and also for the interest of their employees. They want to be able to predict and control But the problem is that the third person method is just it can't, there's so many things you can't measure if we're talking about people. Like, I mean, think first, let me just define terms. Like first person perspective is it's essentially like that a lived experience, right? It's your feelings, your thoughts, it's intentionality, it's even something like meaning, right? These are things that people can tell us, but we can't like peel back their brains and like through neuroscience. I mean, though a physicalist might say you can, right? Someone who's like just as a what I would call like a hard reductionist would say that you can, but the first person experience is like I mean, if you've spent any time with anyone and had any relationship with anyone in any meaningful way, you know that like even from an empathetic standpoint, there's only so much that you can ascertain from their actual experience, their first person experience, right? Where third person experience is essentially like you're extracting everything, right? So you have, click-through rates, we have, somebody clicks on a website, we have all the different, I mean, we could go on and on, right? All the different measurements that are there, but it's like we can't really how do we make a really informed decision if all we're looking at is a third person perspective as a business, right? It gives that illusion. I would call it definitely an illusion of control and predictability. It doesn't tell us about the first person experience of our customers at all. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah, I think I can add something there because, like, in fact, like every complex system, I mean, humans are complex adaptive systems, right? But organizations as well. Every complex adaptive system actually has to trade off like efficiency and resiliency. Like efficiency is the thing that we are focused on in our current way of thinking. And that's why we try to make products for like masses or I mean segments, right? Even though marketing, of course, there's also individual level marketing, but like you cannot only focus on efficiency. And I think that's actually something that we often forget about because those rare events, like Nassim Taleb has called them black swans, right? They're very common in like an organic world where you have complex adaptive systems because of feedback, right? I mean, things that are successful are typically becoming more successful. And that's especially the case in our very highly connected world. So then you get those black swans that no one can predict beforehand, and they can be negative. There can also be positive events, of course, but like those black swans you need to prepare for, and that is typically due to redundancy, right? I mean, you can only prepare for a black swan event if you have cash, if you have, I mean, a connected organization that is maybe more resilient because, I mean, like some of the connected organizations can help the organization that is under threat out. But we have also our connections in the economy are typically that, if you think about a banking system, that if one bank goes bankrupt, right, then all the other banks go bankrupt. But that's because there's no redundancy in this system. And this redundancy is really crucial, just like human beings. I mean, they have friends and family, right, to fall back upon if you're having a difficult time. That's the same for like a complex adaptive system. And if you put that in the customer relationship perspective, right, then of course you want to have your economies of scale, but you also need to have like multiple touch points with the customer. I mean, to make you more resilient, right? Or multiple customers, like a portfolio of customers, because otherwise, I mean, if you purely focus on your efficiency, like you will get in trouble at some point. And I mean, this is true for all complex adaptive systems. And I think we have too much of a focus on the efficiency and not so much on the resiliency currently, because the black swans you don't observe and then you forget about them.
if I may just add like an analogy to kind of like make this more clear, there's a difference between like an hour with friends and a glass of wine, right? And an hour taking a test, right?
Right.
So it's like there's live time and then there's clock time. So there's the experience of time and how we experience is a first person perspective of time itself. And that is highly contextual and environmental. And it will, I mean, I can give you two different contexts, two different environments. But in terms of abstraction, the time is the same.
Yeah.
It's still 1 hour in both scenarios, right? So if as marketers, we're only looking at clock time all the time, we can say like those two different experiences are very different for the people living in that time. They don't have the same experience. If you were to have a conversation with them, it's going to be completely different. And whatever occurred there, like even as we just think about our own experiences, it's like, yeah, an hour of wine with friends is much different than going to take a test that takes an hour. It's like totally different. The thing that's going on in your head, the things that you're feeling, whatever your intention is, what that means to you, everything is different. But from a clock's perspective, it's just an hour. And there's no difference. There's no differentiation between the two. And marketing has become clock time. Everything is clock time. And there's no lived experience because because we've become so subsumed, our worldview has become so infiltrated, I guess, if you will, maybe a bit too aggressive, by this third person view that we think that that is reality. And that simple analogy that I just gave you, it's not, that 1 hour is just an abstraction. It's it. Like we only abstract time because we experience time. We only abstract temperature because we experience it. And I mean, even from a science, like this isn't anti-science. It's that it's understanding that all science begins and ends with experience. Like we measure what if we didn't experience temperature, if we didn't experience hot and cold, we would have never thought to even abstract it to begin with. So does that answer? Am I getting too long-winded with what I'm saying?
No, I mean, this is why we're here. We're definitely going to have to do another one because we will run out of time. But I mean, I love these conversations. I do, because we were talking about efficiency. I want to get into the meat of, so just for people listening or watching,
sure.
One of the things Christian said to me in DM was that he believes that, or actually has a good case to make, that ROI, the efficiency metric, right? We're talking about efficiency, actually assumes a mechanistic world or reality. And so I would love to just get into that claim, as well as what does mechanistic mean? And then what are some of the problems with focusing only on ROI as opposed to another effectiveness metric? But if we can start, Christian, with kind of just giving some context there for people, that would be awesome.
Okay, so ROI, let's just start with the mechanistic worldview.
Sure.
I mean, it's very like some of the metaphors that Auke mentioned earlier. Like, I mean, AI has the prevalence that it has because this mechanism, we think of the mind as a machine in a sense, because it's just simply inputs and outputs. But if you know anything about the philosophy of mind and thought, there's a lot of different ways of actually thinking about this. Consciousness and intentionality and all these things that, I mean, or you may be familiar with the John Searle argument with the man who was, he basically he's given instructions on how to decode Chinese, but just because he's given instructions on how to decode Chinese doesn't mean he understands Chinese. And that's kind of essentially the way that computer systems work. But mechanistic is essentially like it's, like we tend to think, and this is a whole nother go, we could go so many different directions with this. We tend to think of causality as purely, in Aristotelian terms, efficient causality, right? And so it's just A plus X, A acts on B, and that equals C. And you see that as well, even in econometrics, which is supposed to be all about effectiveness and not so much about efficiency, like what we're talking about, but it's still 100% efficient cause.
Well, it's in fact X leads to Y leads to Z, right? You always try to find like a cause of something, and typically only one. And then you get this whole chain of effects. So if you know the initial conditions, then you can also know the outcome. It's just it's just setting it in motion, right? Like if you set it in motion, then you can perfectly predict the outcome. And of course, I mean that denies uncertainty. It's like deterministic, and it's actually kind of ironic that allows for like a God ultimately, because like someone has to put the whole thing in motion, right? But that's the assumption kind of behind it. But there are other causes, and I don't know whether you wanted to elaborate on those causes, but like Aristotle had multiple causes, right? And we typically ignore those kind of causes. And I think the most important one is actually a final cause. And a final cause is kind of a purpose. And like, if you think about it, like science excludes purpose, right? I mean, we always say like evolution is kind of a blind process. And I mean, it can lead to anything. But if you look at the first person perspective, then actually what an organism does is keeping itself alive. So it's like self-perpetuating. And that is kind of the purpose. And this is also why AI can actually never be truly intelligent. Because like it doesn't have like, I mean, it's not fragile, like you said, Christian, earlier. Like, I mean, if you make something fragile, then like what like an organism does is it avoids dangers, right? And it approaches things that may help its survival, so food and stuff. And I think that's kind of the, like an organization, you can also think of that this way. Like I think that is what like a purely mechanistic perspective, I mean, cannot handle, because like it's just something that works on it from the outside. Something has to cause you to move, but this final cause begins inside of you, right? And so that's actually truly the first person perspective that's actually happening. And in an organization, I mean, just to give you an idea, I think like an organization, of course, wants to be self-perpetuating, and I mean, and it is typically, but you do that actually by giving the individuals within the organization like the freedom to fulfill their roles, right? So you have actually part, which is like the departments and the people in your organization. Then you have the whole, which is the organization, like I mean the whole organization. And like in a mechanistic worldview, you would say, okay, the departments drive the outcome of the organization, like the parts lead to the whole. But in a more organic way of thinking, it goes actually, the causality goes both directions. So you also have some kind of vertical causation, like you have actually the whole that also drives the part. And I think for me, the best way to understand this is actually to think about a book, right? If you read a book, then each chapter determines like the plot, right? Like the whole plot of the book. But also you make sense of the individual chapters by understanding the holistic story, right? And therefore you have this causation going in both ways. And a purely mechanistic point of view would rule that out. Like it's not possible. And this is also, I mean, you can compare this with emergence, right? Like you have actually parts that interact, they lead to a whole, but you can never you can never replicate that. Context matters. So I mean, in fact, when we talk about emergence, you're basically saying we don't understand it, because the sum of the parts is, I mean, the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts in a way. And like that's this complexity thinking. And in a market, that's also the case, right? Like an outcome of a market is typically unpredictable. And that is because there are several different mechanisms that can lead to the same outcome, right? Think about like contagion. I mean, certain products, they become popular because people influence each other. But that means that you can beforehand never predict which products become actually successful. And that is also why you have like typically fat tail distributions. And a fat tail distribution is like a few, I mean, if you think about product success, you have a few products that are extremely successful, like the 50 Shades of Grey, Taylor Swift, and the Harry Potter. Right? And then you have a lot of products that are not so successful, and they determine together this long tail. And that was, in fact, like, I mean, I still remember when Spotify was launched, right? And people said, okay, now you can finally listen to the music that you really prefer, because, you know, I mean, there's no distribution costs, there are no storage costs, and people can find the music that they like, even if you have a very obscure taste, right? But it didn't work out that way because there were those feedback effects. So what you see in an online market is even an amplified version of an offline market. You get these feedback effects, and as a result of that, you get actually these products, few products that become extremely successful at the expense of maybe the other products. And I think markets typically converge to that, but an online environment facilitates that because you get this social comparison. So from an outcome perspective, like you cannot really predict those outcomes, because I mean it's impossible to, I mean, it's not even related to product quality anymore, right? The contagion may actually work on very small initial differences, like the butterfly effect. If on Amazon your first rating is like not a 5, right? Your product will never be a bestseller.
Yeah. No, I think that hits the nail on the head in terms of ROI. And so I just love to give Christian any thoughts in terms of the ROI side of things.
Sure. I think it all just goes to, first and foremost, not every asset class has a direct return on investment. I think marketing is one of those asset classes that there's not a measurable return on investment, just kind of like a building. But just to kind of like make everything, maybe a simple analogy, so like a mechanistic worldview would be essentially, let's say you have a glass of water and you put a sugar cube in the water. In a mechanistic world, the water is acting on the sugar to dissolve it, right? And so the effect of that is sugary water, but the causal mechanism is the water on the sugar cube. Essentially, in a mechanistic world, the sugar cube is passive. But we know from a biology standpoint that that's actually not correct, right? The two are acting on one another. And so from a more organic perspective, I think it's important that we understand that, like, the customer is involved in creating these realities as well. It's not just simply like we do something and it causes X, Y, Z to happen. And now we need to figure out what we did that caused Y to happen, because the customer is essentially just this passive sugar cube and we're acting on it. And it's causality is dynamic. It's participatory in organic systems. And we're dealing with people. We're not dealing with machines where you do X and you get Y. If the mechanistic worldview is wrong, then we're seriously missing a lot of pieces. We're missing a lot of, I wouldn't say information, but we're missing a lot of parts of the story, right? We're not seeing the full story, and information and story are different. So if causality is dynamic, and it is in the organic world, and I'm talking about, like, this is through empirical observation. Like, that's what science seems to affirm. The sugar cube and the water are acting on each other to create a new reality, right? Sugar, water, right? So there's still, from a business perspective, this is kind of like when I deal with an airline, and we all love dealing with airlines. And I was actually flying. Do you guys remember when, like, there was this huge system crash? I don't know what system it was for the airlines, and basically every plane was grounded. There was like some kind of software system that all these airlines use, and it crashed, and all planes were grounded. I was supposed to fly to Savannah that day, and I didn't fly. Frustrating. Okay, there's an emotion, first person experience, whatever. How I respond to that and how I navigate that experience in that situation has bearing on how that impacts that business, right? And what is going to happen? How am I going to deal with that? And obviously they made decisions and they offered refunds and they offered credits and whatnot. But in that particular situation, there's maybe not much I can do as a customer, whatever, but I may never choose to fly with them again, depending on how they handle the situation. And I think what I'm just trying to simply say is that it is participatory. It is dynamic. Whatever is, like, the things that you were talking about earlier, Auke, with how certain things work and how certain, business and brands and products work and some don't. It's just understanding that what is creating, whatever is causing, X to happen, whether like the sugar water, these things, the customers are participating. We're acting on each other to create a reality. And instead of thinking, well, like, what is marketing doing to cause this to happen, right? But that's the way that we're looking at it. We're looking to see what has marketing done, because we see these things mechanistically. What have we done? What lever do we need to, what dial do we need to turn? What campaign do we need to do to make XYZ happen, right? And it just doesn't work like that. Customers are involved in the process, and there's no way, please help me understand what predictive model you have out there that's going to tell you how I'm going to respond to what happened with airline. Like, where is that? But that's part of the equation. That's part of what happens when we're customers. Like, I think for me, that's just if we get into the whole brand thing, it's like, why do I have to have data to support what I already experience as a customer, what I already know? What just seems common sense to me in terms of like how things work, right? Like it just seems like there's this constant appeal. And I'm kind of getting off on a tangent here, but there's this constant appeal to measure everything. And anything I say, if I'm going to make an argument for why it works, I've got to have data and I've got to have that third person perspective to support that, right? When if the reality is that what causes success in business is way more dynamic and way more complex and is not something that we can predict. If we could accept that, then I think the pressure for marketing to measure everything would not be so significant, right? But like economies, like let's just face it, the economy is still not in a great position. I've talked to a lot of people who've been doing this longer than me and have more credentials than I do, and they're struggling. They're struggling to find work. And one of the most frustrating things I think for me is like every single marketing job that I look at, it's everything about the job description is just it is so clear and evident that this business has a mechanistic worldview. And if you want to be a marketer, you're going to have to assume that worldview. But the problem for me is that like I don't think it's logically coherent. I don't think it's coherent. And I like that it has no basis for me. It has no basis in reality to do everything around that. But it's such the dominant narrative from marketing, from marketers, from the world, from like just this society and culture that, I mean, it's all you have to do. Look at every marketing job out there, and it's data driven, data, like every single thing that I've seen.
In fact, like if it would be predictable what firms do, right, that wouldn't be a competitive advantage because it would be predictable for everyone. And like this is actually explained in this book by Rory Sutherland. And he says like you have to be illogic in a market in order to, I mean, you need to be unpredictable in order to have a sustainable competitive advantage. And we take it the exact opposite way. And I think it's the same from the consumer's perspective. This stuff that Kahneman writes about, the biases, that assumes that people have full information, right? I mean, they know the outcomes, the possible outcomes, they know the associated probabilities for each outcomes. No one has that. So you cannot make informed choices like that. And it seems to be a stretch to me that you call people biased who don't comply with that model. That model is just wrong. In fact, there was a recent article that showed that Kahneman's claim that people are bad intuitive statisticians is actually wrong if you change the way people get the information, because Kahneman gives you like the full description at once. But normally how people learn is, of course, by doing something like the Bayesian way, right? You get some feedback and then you try to improve your decision, right? Or to adjust if you made a mistake. If you do that and people get feedback on their choices and then can repeatedly make choices, then people actually do much better. They are very good intuitive statisticians. And that's the organic way of learning. And it's actually quite interesting because there's a Norwegian guy who introduced a new paradigm in economics, which is a bit like a counterforce against this expected utility thinking. Because he says, like, you in the real world, you don't have parallel worlds, right? I mean, Kahneman assumes that in world A, you can choose outcome A with a certain probability. In world B, you can choose another outcome with a, let's say, a smaller probability. And like if you take, and he calls this ergodicity economics, and in engineering, an ergodic system is a system where the cross-sectional average is the same as the time average. But if you think about this from a longitudinal perspective, then if people face a situation where they can have an enormous loss, right? So let's say you're 50% chance of losing $500,000 and 50% chance of gaining $750,000, right? Then Kahneman would say you should do that because the expected value is actually positive. But this Ole Peter says, no, you shouldn't do that because in that world where you lose $500,000, you're bankrupt and then there is no tomorrow. And if you think about it in the time perspective, then those decisions become actually rational as people avoid losses at all costs. Like, I think that there's also implications for marketing. I mean, think about the incident that you talked about with the airline, right? Like if they screw up, like then the whole future cash stream that they could gain from you actually disappears. Like if you think that this is truly customer centricity, right? Like if you think from the consumer's perspective and maybe not so much from the product or the brand's perspective, then you get this view about like the cash flow. And like then you would try to avoid, at least for good customers, you would try to avoid at all costs screwing up things. And of course, it's not always possible, but like this is this ergodic way of thinking.
I love that. I would love to ask you both about kind of bridging the gap between what we're talking about and then the world where marketers have salaries and are expected to do stuff. I think one of the things I notice sometimes is in some cases you can have only the, let's call it the academic side without the world experience, but world experience without any backing on the academic side can also lead you in the wrong direction. So how do we start thinking about, given the things that we're talking about, like marketers have to take actions. There are things that we are held accountable to from what is expected if we put this amount of budget in this versus not. Like, how should we begin thinking about like actual marketers in businesses approaching the reality that we're talking about? Because going to most CFOs and saying maybe the ROI conversation asset classes, a lot of CFOs will understand that, but just saying, well, I'm not a determinist, so that's also not going to fly. So how should marketers and business leaders actually start kind of bridging this gap, like practically in the world?
Well, I think one thing is also the way we do research. Like, I think we should probably do more qualitative research because a narrative gives you a much better understanding of what people actually face. And of course, I mean, then you always have limited samples, but I still think that that can be more informative about the problems that customers face than purely looking at the parts of a customer relationship, right? And not being able to put the story together again. So from my perspective, like the qualitative research is really important to complement what we are currently doing. I'm not saying that we should move completely away from like the efficiency thinking. Of course, that's important too. As I said, like a complex system needs both. But I think we need to probably get a little bit more into like the resiliency thinking as well. So what are the real issues that customers face and how can we address those? And like I would also really make a plea for like, I mean, making decisions based on intuitions, right? I mean, if we use more of the AI models, like reality is in principle not computational. Like cognition is not computational. It cannot be because of the unexpected events. And like I think if you take humans, I mean, we always have to deal with the uncertainty. So we have that intuitive understanding. And like, I think the measurement moves us kind of away from this more commonsensical understanding of things, which makes us sometimes make like suboptimal decisions.
Well, I'm a real revolutionist and anarchist here. I'll be an anarchist. I think we have to start pushing back. I think I think this conversation needs to be more prevalent among marketers, and marketers as a whole need to really. I hope we can start to like see the deficiencies in this worldview, because if you're right, I mean, you can't like be like, oh, I'm not a determinist. Like, let me explain to you why. But I mean, in a sense, we're also culpable. I think marketing is also culpable for why we are where we are. It's not like we all have this, like, as a society, we have this worldview. So, of course, it's going to make its way into marketing, right? So what's necessary is a change. This conversation, I think, is the most important conversation to have in marketing, because it requires a change in worldview. And then when that worldview changes, we start to push back on these things. And I think like to piggy on what Auke is saying, it's like, so let's think about going back to the airline. Now, if I've done enough qualitative research to understand like how do customers feel when these fluke events happen and what do they want? How do they want to be treated, right? Like, do I want to be treated like I'm just a number that paid for this airline and that they have no consideration for how this has impacted my entire plan? I had all these plans. I did all this planning to go to Savannah. I mean, I did all this research. I was going to go here. I'd paid. I mean, I lost money at the hotel. I lost my miles at the hotel that I'm not going to be able to get back. It's a serious inconvenience. If marketing is doing appropriate qualitative research in a situation like that, guess what? Like, you need to be intuitive. Like, how are you going to respond to this event that happened that no one could predict? and how are you going to handle it? Like, and so to go back to your thing with the CFO, as a marketer, if I've done appropriate qualitative research for both these kinds of situations, whether they've happened in the past, or I start to think about like what would happen, what if XYZ happened, how would you feel? What would you want as a customer? How would you want to be treated as a customer? How would you want me to handle this situation? If I know these things and I've had these conversations and enough of these conversations, and I can tell you this, I mean, this is what I would say to a CFO. I can't predict what's going to happen if this happens at how every customer is going to respond. I can't, but I can tell you how these customers, what these customers would want. And I think it's a fair assumption to make that most customers are probably going to feel similarly. And if we treat them like human beings, we treat them like customers, and we go out of our way to make sure that they're, it's been probably, maybe it's going to cost us money up front, but we go out of our way to let them know that we care about the inconvenience. And so we're going to provide them with the credit, and we're not fighting. We're not going through like corporate hoops to like take care of the person who's impacted by this event. Like, the long term is going to pay off. The hard part here is, though, is all I have is my own first person experience, right? Whether that's the customer I'm talking to or me talking as a customer. And so the hard part here is that is in this new worldview, or in this worldview, that's not considered to be enough information, right? For a CFO to act on. Like, where's your data? It's like, I mean, all I can simply say is like, I booked that airline again because of how they treated me, right? And I imagine that other people who were treated similarly reacted in a similar manner, and I don't see why that wouldn't create and cultivate long-term success for the business. But I can't quantify that, right? And so I guess my pushback is like, if that CFO, okay, or CEO, I don't care what his C is in front of the other following letters, if that is not enough, if that story is not enough for him to be like, okay, yeah, we need to really invest in this, and this is important, and we really understand who our customers are and how they feel and what this means to them, so that, whether it's reactive or preventative or it's proactive, whatever campaign strategy we have, or customer experience, or whatever we're doing here as a whole organization, if that conversation is not seen or deemed to be a picture of reality or even something worth considering, then I don't know how you even have these kinds of conversations with C-suite, honestly. If that's not even something that's allowed to be brought to the table. And I think that's my frustration to begin with, is like, everything has to be, as marketers, I think if we have to start bringing that qualitative research, we have to start bringing that, and we have to push we have to be comfortable with uncertainty, even if people above us are demanding a level of certainty and predictability and control that we can't give them. Like, I think we just have to be, if we've really worked through this and we've done this enough, you've had enough experience, you've done marketing for how long, Braden?
A decade.
So, I mean, that these things, people aren't predictable. The level of control is not there.
Marketers are lying to executive teams when they make promises that depend on things that they can't know or prove. I would agree with you. I think there's a middle ground that has to happen. I also think a lot of marketers, they don't know how to have this conversation that we're having right now, or even they don't know that if they're going to use data, what data to use. So I would agree with you overall. And it's a challenging spot to be if you're not equipped with knowledge or the counter arguments too, right?
But this is really hard, because you also see this in actually the academic world. Like, we hire more and more quantitative people, and then like it turns out to be really hard to teach those people business. And I think the reason for that is actually that this business is kind of a mindset. That's not a set of concepts that you learn, because, well, I was initially mistaken about it. I always thought, okay, it's easier to teach someone who knows already statistics, to teach that person marketing, but turns out it's impossible, and it's much easier to teach like a marketeer statistics. And I think it has exactly to do with this, like we are talking about a mindset, not like a set of concepts that you can use. Like that requires a kind of loose model. And it's very interesting that in our brains, actually, we have those two modules. Like our left-hand side of the brain is actually the analytical mindset. That's where language resides. But then you also have the right-hand side of the brain, like the right hemisphere, which is much more holistic and actually puts all the details in a bigger picture again after it has been analyzed by the left hemisphere. And I think that's in fact what we need, like people that can zoom out from a situation and say, but if you want to solve this properly, then we have to do X, Z, and Y. And like if you just optimize on one variable, it's never going to work because you take this third person perspective and not the first person perspective. And I think that is for people who are just into measurement, it's really hard. Like they just think in those targets without zooming out and saying, okay, but what does the target actually mean in the bigger context? And are there situations where we shouldn't probably?
I would say this. I think the C-suite needs to start acting like a baseball coach, in a sense, right? Because it's like, I mean, imagine if a pitcher on every pitch had to give a full-blown analysis and predictive model for how he's going to pitch every pitch. How long would the game take? Would anybody watch it? Right? Like, and this is the heuristic intuitive side. There are environments and situations where analysis leads to paralysis. And this is essentially what we've done. And this is where experience come in. Like, think about an outfielder, right? Does he when a ball hits the bat and it's coming at him, he's not doing, regression analysis and all the variables that are at play here in terms of like where to go to catch the ball. He is intuitively through heuristics looking at the ball, knows how to judge the ball, and he does so based upon his experience over time and being an outfielder. And obviously, but I mean, he didn't just get up I mean, I don't know if anybody played baseball on this, but I did. It's not like I got out there first day that I ever played baseball and somebody hit me a pop fly and I just boom. Like I had to learn how to catch the ball. I had to learn how to, in some way, intuitively predict where the ball was going to go so I could be there when the ball needed to be caught. And that's only going to happen through experience. It's not going to happen through analysis. So I think a lot of all executives need to start being coaches and stop trying to be mathematicians and be comfortable with things failing. Right? Because really the whole, like we said earlier, predictability and control is an illusion. And we got to put the pitcher out. He might throw strikes. Someone might hit a home run. Right. And I think as marketers, we have to be, because we're shooting ourselves in the foot. I mean, if the coach says, I only want you to get on that mound if you're going to strike everybody out this round, then the pitcher's never going to get on the mound. And no matter, I mean, even if you're Nolan Ryan, you're not striking everybody out, right? And I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense. I think that when we start to look at things differently and start seeing the marketing team as kind of like as a team, as players who have experiences that are going to make, try things. They're going to get things right. We're going to talk to customers. They're going to do the work, but we're going to get things right. We're going to get things wrong. And until we get to a level, I think, of comfortability with that this is actually how this works. And this is how, and marketing works and how running a business works. As marketers, I think we're not forced, but we choose to lie. And we choose to use data to say whatever we want it to say so that we can keep our job, right?
And I think it's very interesting what you say, because this is kind of like it requires like autonomy at the lowest level in the organization, right? And then you get to the idea of kind of unity through multiplicity, which you will probably find appealing, Christian. Because like, I think that's exactly what it is. Like you create the best possible sports team by giving each player the complete freedom at their position to do what they want, right? I mean, and of course, I mean, in alignment with the organizational goals. But I actually think that is a very good metaphor to think about an organization, like give people the flexibility to decide. And you'll probably realize that the best possible outcome for the organization as a whole, right? Like, and that goes back to what I said earlier about this causality, like from two sides, like from the bottom up, the parts determine the whole, but then the whole also pushes you back into your role. So if you think about soccer team, like I mean, the striker contributes to the team as a whole, just like the defender does, but in their own way. And then, of course, because of the success of the team, hopefully, I mean, they are also influenced again by the higher level of organization. And I think that's a good way to think about like marketing in an organization. So if people face customers, right, I mean, they need to decide themselves what to do. And like if it would be predictable, like then you get to a kind of cookbook recipe for, I mean, what to do in situation X and Y and Z, but it's not possible. So that's why you need to give people the freedom, and they will solve it in best possible way through like intuition. Sorry?
I said that sounds like a corporation. It sounds like Starbucks.
And Starbucks has been, well, we could talk about them, but listen, I've loved this conversation. I definitely think there's another one in the cards. It's an important one. If we can finish by where people can find you, if they want to contact you, work with you, etc., that'd be great.
Yeah, the best way to find me is just on LinkedIn. My website portfolio is there as well. But yeah, just hit me up on LinkedIn. I write about these things, and then I also write about other things. So yeah.
Go follow Christian for sure. Go follow both of them.
I think that's the same for me. I mean, you can find me on the website of my school, of course, BI Norwegian Business School, but I think the best possible way is actually through LinkedIn. And I write on those topics as well. So if you find it interesting, I mean, I share some content there.
Amazing. Well, listen, if you're listening to this too, please do share this like as much as possible. I do think this is a conversation that just needs to continue happening. And to Christian's point, like marketers need to begin to be equipped to at least start having these conversations and pushing back where it's appropriate, because otherwise the industry, I think, is going to continue going in the wrong direction. But thank you both very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Anytime. Thank you.